Princess Anne had spent a lifetime mastering restraint. She rarely wasted words, rarely surrendered to sentiment in public, and almost never allowed private grief to interfere with duty. That was exactly why the room changed when she finally spoke. Looking across a gathering filled with senior members of the royal family, Anne delivered one devastating sentence: "Philip is the duke this palace will never replace." And within seconds, everyone understood this was about far more than memory. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne had chosen her moment carefully. The statement came during a private royal gathering focused on continuity, duty, and the future structure of senior family roles, and every person present understood the weight of what she was saying. The Duke of Edinburgh is a senior royal title historically associated with the monarch's close family, but for Anne, the title could never be separated from Prince Philip himself. He had been her father, the Queen's husband, and a figure whose identity became tied to discipline, service, and relentless support of the crown. Anne was not merely praising a former title holder, she was drawing a line between a title that could pass on and a man she believed could never be duplicated. Anne kept her voice controlled, but those closest to her could hear the emotion beneath every word. She had watched Philip's legacy become increasingly discussed through anniversaries, ceremonies, and historical references, and part of her feared that the institution was beginning to flatten him into something distant. Edward felt the force of that tension immediately. He now carried the Duke of Edinburgh title himself, and hearing his sister say that Philip was the duke the palace could never replace created an uncomfortable truth. Respect for their father could suddenly sound like doubt about the brother who followed him. Charles did not interrupt. The king folded his hands and remained silent, and that silence mattered because he clearly understood why Anne had chosen those words. Sophie noticed the danger almost at once. She glanced toward Edward, knowing that the remark could be heard two ways: as a deeply personal tribute to Philip, or as a quiet declaration that no future holder of the title could ever fully measure up. Anne finished speaking, and placed both hands flat on the table. Then she looked directly toward Edward. Nobody rushed to fill the silence. Edward did not challenge her in front of the family. He waited until the gathering ended, then quietly asked Anne for a private conversation. Because the most painful question was no longer whether Anne still mourned Philip. It was whether Edward believed her tribute had quietly diminished everything he had spent years trying to build. Edward had inherited a title. Anne had inherited something far harder to define: her father's discipline, his bluntness, his emotional restraint, and perhaps even his refusal to ask for sympathy. That difference suddenly mattered, because when Anne declared that Philip could never be replaced, Edward heard love, but he also heard a boundary being drawn around a role he now carried every day. Edward understood the contradiction better than most. Becoming Duke of Edinburgh tied him directly to Prince Philip's legacy, while forcing him to build a version of the role that belonged to a different generation. The title itself is a senior royal dukedom, associated with public service and family duty. But for Edward, it carried something more personal: his father's shadow. Anne experienced Philip differently. She had inherited his directness, practical mind, and deep belief that service mattered more than display. She did not need ceremonies to remember him. She carried parts of him in the way she moved through duty. Edward admitted privately to Sophie that Anne's words had hurt more than he expected. He told her he had never tried to replace their father and had never wanted the public to see him as an imitation of Philip. Sophie listened before reminding him that Anne had spoken about Philip the man, not Edward the Duke. Still, Edward could not let go of the exact wording. His sister had chosen it too carefully. Anne was carrying a different frustration. She later told Zara that palace language around Philip had become too neat, too careful, too historical. He was increasingly being reduced to anniversaries, archived speeches, and formal references, rather than remembered as the force who once shaped the family from inside. Zara understood the anger beneath her mother's restraint. Anne feared that reverence was slowly becoming distance. Charles saw both sides. The king knew the monarchy could not freeze titles in time, simply because one person had defined them so powerfully. Roles had to continue. Yet he also understood that certain personalities became inseparable from the eras they shaped, and Philip was one of them. Edward stood alone after his conversation with Sophie and paused beside a framed photograph of his father. He touched the edge of the frame, then pulled his hand away. "I never wanted to be him," he said quietly. Sophie stayed beside him, knowing the sentence carried both loyalty and pain. Edward believed Anne's statement had come from grief, but Anne knew the truth was sharper. Months earlier, one ceremony had convinced her that the palace was beginning to turn Philip into memory before the family was ready to let him go. And that was the moment when silence, to Anne, stopped feeling respectful and started feeling like surrender. The breaking point had come months earlier, during a ceremony that was supposed to honor continuity. Instead, Anne walked away convinced that something essential had been lost. Philip's name appeared in the program. His achievements were mentioned. His title was acknowledged. Yet for Anne, the entire tribute felt strangely hollow, as though the palace was preserving the outline of a man, while slowly forgetting the force that had once filled it. Anne had initially supported the effort to modernize older royal roles. She understood better than most that monarchy survives by adapting rather than copying the past word for word. The Duke of Edinburgh Youth Awards were designed to encourage young people through challenge, service, and personal development, and Philip had been deeply associated with that mission for decades. Edward now carried responsibility for taking that legacy forward. Anne accepted that. What troubled her was the growing sense that continuity was becoming an excuse to smooth away everything difficult, blunt, or unmistakably Philip. The decisive moment came during an anniversary ceremony at Windsor. A revised speech referred repeatedly to the office, the legacy, and the continuing title. But one paragraph had vanished. Anne noticed immediately. That missing passage had described Philip's belief that service should challenge people rather than flatter them, a line that captured the hard edge beneath his public duty. After the ceremony, Anne approached an aide and asked who had approved the edit. When she was told the wording had been considered too personal for a continuity event, her expression changed. Edward defended the decision later. He told Anne that the ceremony had been designed to look forward, not recreate their father. She understood the argument, but her answer was sharp. Looking forward should never require making Philip easier to remember. Edward fell quiet because he knew she was not demanding imitation. She was defending complexity. Anne then asked to see the original speech. She read the first draft and discovered the personal passage had been there from the beginning. It had been deliberately softened after concern that the ceremony might seem too centered on Philip instead of Edward. Anne read the removed paragraph twice, closed the folder, and said quietly, "That was the part that sounded like him." She kept a copy. Anne told only Zara that the palace was beginning to confuse succession with substitution. Zara understood immediately that her mother was no longer upset about one speech. She was watching language reshape memory. Months later, when senior royals began discussing how the Edinburgh role should evolve, Anne remembered that deleted paragraph. This time, she refused to stay silent. By the time those explosive words finally came, Anne was no longer defending a title. She was challenging the idea that Philip's place could ever be transferred at all. There were no courtiers between them when Edward finally confronted his sister. No cameras, no advisors, no carefully prepared language. Just two children of Philip standing on opposite sides of a private room, carrying the same grief in completely different ways. Edward asked the question Anne knew was coming. "When you said he could never be replaced, were you talking about me?" Her answer stopped him cold. Edward had requested the meeting because he needed an answer from Anne herself, not from aides interpreting tone or family members guessing at intent. A courtier is a member of the royal household who assists senior royals and helps manage official life, but this conversation deliberately excluded that entire layer. Anne agreed immediately. She knew the statement had become bigger than she intended, and she refused to let palace interpretation define something that belonged first to their family. Edward did not hide the hurt. He told Anne he had spent years making sure he never copied Philip, because imitation would insult both of them. He had accepted the Duke of Edinburgh title, knowing it carried history, but he had also tried to build a version of the role that belonged to his own generation. Anne's words, he admitted, made him feel as though he had been judged simply for accepting what had been passed to him. The accusation in his voice was controlled, but the sadness underneath it was impossible to miss. Anne answered just as directly. Her anger was not with Edward. It was with an institution that sometimes spoke about succession as though people themselves could be replaced when titles moved from one person to another. She told him that continuity mattered, but continuity was not duplication. Philip's identity had been shaped by decades of personality, sacrifice, conflict, and service. No ceremony could transfer that. Edward finally asked the question beneath every other question. Did Anne believe he should have become Duke of Edinburgh at all? She stepped closer. Yes, but as yourself. Edward went quiet. Anne continued. You inherited his title. You were never asked to inherit his identity. The sentence changed everything. Edward suddenly understood that her statement had not been a rejection of him. In a painful way, it had been a defense of his right to be different. His anger softened, and he admitted something he had rarely said aloud. Carrying Philip's title sometimes made him miss his father more, not less. Anne understood that immediately. The brother and sister had finally reached the same place, but the wider problem remained. Because now Charles faced a harder question. If even Philip's children needed the distinction explained, how could the palace protect their father's legacy without making Edward's future feel secondary? That answer would have to come from the king himself. Charles had spent most of his life living in Philip's shadow, differently from Anne or Edward. Philip had been his father, his critic, his protector, and at times the person whose expectations felt almost impossible to satisfy. Now as king, Charles faced a dilemma no constitutional handbook could solve. A title could pass cleanly from one generation to another. A father's place could not. Charles understood that he had the authority to shape how the royal household spoke about legacy, ceremony, and the duties attached to current working roles. The royal household is the network of staff and offices that supports the monarch and senior royals in their official work, which meant even small changes in language could influence how the family was publicly understood. Yet the king also knew the danger. If he leaned too heavily toward Philip's memory, Edward could appear diminished. If he focused only on the present, Anne might believe their father was being reduced to history. Charles admitted that fear privately to Camilla. Anne's words had unsettled him because they exposed something he had spent years avoiding. Philip's absence had not simply removed one man from the family. It had changed the emotional balance between all of them. Camilla listened carefully and urged the king not to demand any correction from his sister. She warned that treating Anne's statement as an attack would transform grief into a public family dispute, and Charles knew she was right. Charles then met Edward directly. He pushed aside the prepared briefing and made one thing clear. The modern Duke of Edinburgh role would not be rebuilt around Philip's personality. Edward would be encouraged to create his own version of service, shaped by his own strengths, rather than by imitation. The king looked at his brother and said, "You do not honor him by becoming him." Edward heard the distinction immediately. For perhaps the first time since Anne's statement, the title felt less like a comparison and more like permission. Charles made a second decision just as important. He instructed aides that future commemorations must clearly separate Philip's personal legacy from the living office of the Duke of Edinburgh. In simple terms, the man and the title would no longer be spoken about as though they were interchangeable. Edward could carry the role forward without being asked to carry his father's identity with it. Charles sat alone after the meeting with one of Philip's old handwritten notes in front of him. The message contained blunt advice about duty, exactly the kind of sentence his father had once delivered, without comfort or decoration. The king read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it away. Inside the family, a distinction had finally been made. But beyond palace walls, Anne's words were beginning to spread, and the public was about to turn one deeply personal sentence into a verdict on Edward himself. The first headline Edward saw the next morning reduced everything to 6 brutal words: Anne, Philip can never be replaced. There was no room for nuance beneath it. No explanation that she supported Edward. No mention of their private reconciliation. Just an image of Philip beside a photograph of the current Duke. And suddenly, Edward understood exactly what Anne had feared. The title had become a comparison nobody could win. Edward closed the newspaper and turned it face down. Palace communications staff were already trying to explain that Anne's statement had honored Philip's singular personality rather than questioned her brother's position. Palace communications simply means the staff responsible for presenting royal activity and clarifying public misunderstandings. But even careful wording could not erase the emotional force of the headline. Edward knew that canceling his scheduled duties would only make the story bigger. If he withdrew now, the public might read his absence as proof that the family dispute had shaken him. Edward admitted the truth to Sophie before leaving. Every public mention of Philip was beginning to feel like a test of whether he was enough, even though he had never believed the Duke of Edinburgh role should work that way. Sophie immediately pushed back. She reminded him that inheriting a historic title meant continuing service, not reproducing personality. Philip had been one man, Edward was another. If the monarchy confused those two truths, then nobody who came after a powerful predecessor could ever succeed on their own terms. Anne saw the same coverage and called her brother directly. She told Edward that if her words were being used to attack him, she would correct the interpretation herself. She would not allow their father's memory to become a weapon against Philip's son. Edward surprised her. He asked Anne not to retract anything. Edward told his sister that the discomfort might actually be necessary. Too many people had begun treating titles as though they automatically reproduced the individuals who once carried them. Anne listened differently this time. Her statement had begun as a defense of Philip, but Edward was showing her another consequence. Protecting their father's uniqueness also meant protecting his successor from impossible comparison. Edward straightened his jacket before leaving for his engagement and paused at the doorway. Sophie watched him carefully. He looked back at her and said, "Then I do this as me." The decision was simple but powerful. Edward would not retreat, imitate Philip, or apologize for being different. Anne understood the shift the moment the call ended. For the first time, she realized her statement did not have to divide past from present. It could do something far more important: free both men from a comparison neither had ever asked for. The second conversation was nothing like the first. There was no anger left between them, only exhaustion and memory. Anne and Edward met without aides, without Sophie, without Charles, and without any palace language to protect them from what they actually felt. This time they did not discuss titles. They talked about their father. And what Edward admitted finally changed the meaning of Anne's statement completely. Anne asked for the meeting because she wanted Edward to understand why the Windsor ceremony had affected her so deeply. A private family conversation simply meant there were no staff, no formal record, and no pressure to speak in the careful language expected around senior royals. Edward agreed because the public reaction had shown him something painful. He and his sister were grieving different versions of the same man. Anne feared Philip was becoming too polished in memory. Edward feared Philip's enormous personality would make every successor look smaller simply for being different. Anne admitted what had been troubling her since their father died. She feared the palace would gradually turn Philip into someone easier, warmer, and more ceremonial than he had ever been in life. The sharp edges would disappear first, then the difficult honesty, then the impatience, the humor, and the relentless standards that had made him unmistakably himself. Edward listened without interrupting, because he finally understood that his sister was not protecting an image. She was protecting the parts of Philip that were hardest to summarize. Edward then admitted his own fear. Carrying the Duke of Edinburgh title sometimes made him feel as though difference itself could be interpreted as failure. He did not want to become Philip, but he worried the public would always measure him against a man whose personality had already become inseparable from the role. Anne heard the contradiction immediately. They had been defending opposite sides of the same truth. Anne reached for the old Windsor speech and showed him the paragraph that had been removed. Edward read the words slowly. He had never been told that passage had been cut. He did not defend the decision. Instead, he gave a tired smile and said their father would probably have hated being polished into something harmless. Anne smiled for the first time. She told Edward that the real tribute was not copying Philip. It was refusing to edit away what had made him difficult, demanding, funny, impatient, and unforgettable. Edward folded the old speech once and returned it to Anne with both hands. Then keep that version. The meaning finally settled between them. Philip could remain irreplaceable, precisely because Edward was never required to replace him. Now the family understood what Anne had meant. The only question left was whether the public would hear that truth or remain trapped by the headline. By the following morning, Anne's words had escaped the palace completely. They were on breakfast television, radio phone-ins, newspaper front pages, and handwritten signs outside Windsor. Yet something unexpected happened. The debate began moving away from whether Edward could replace Philip and toward a deeper question. Should anyone ever be expected to replace the person behind a historic royal title? Broadcasters began framing the story differently. Instead of reducing it to a family feud, they focused on the difference between inherited office and personal legacy. An inherited office simply means a role or title passed from one person to another, while personal legacy belongs to the individual who shaped it through character, choices, and service. Palace communications quietly reinforced the distinction Charles had already approved. Edward carried the modern responsibilities of the Duke of Edinburgh title. Philip's place in royal history remained singular. Edward watched the coverage with mixed feelings. Part of him was relieved that the conversation had finally moved away from judging whether he measured up to his father. Another part still hated seeing his own name placed beside Philip's so relentlessly. Sophie reminded him that the tone had changed. The public was no longer asking why he was not more like Philip. They were beginning to accept that he was never supposed to be. Edward heard that difference, even if it still felt strange. Anne felt uncomfortable for another reason. She had never wanted to become the center of a national debate. Yet she could also see what her sentence had achieved. People were speaking about Philip not simply as a predecessor, but as a difficult, demanding, funny, complicated man whose personality could not be transferred with a title. That mattered to Anne because it was exactly what she had feared the palace might slowly forget. Outside Windsor Castle, the public mood crystallized into one simple moment. A small crowd gathered near the gates, and an elderly man held up a handwritten sign that read, "A title continues. A man doesn't." The image spread quickly across morning coverage. Hours later, a major newspaper ran side-by-side photographs of Philip and Edward beneath another blunt headline. One title, two different men. Edward saw the Windsor sign on television and quietly nodded. Later that day, he publicly praised Philip's example while speaking clearly about his own priorities in the present tense. He honored his father without imitating him. For the first time, the public conversation matched what the family had already accepted privately. Now only one moment remained. Anne, Edward, and Charles had found the words. The country had understood them. But one final family gathering would decide whether Philip's memory remained a shadow over the present or became something far more generous. In the end, Princess Anne's statement did not diminish Edward. It liberated him. Philip remained irreplaceable, not because no one else could serve, not because the Edinburgh title belonged permanently to the past, and not because the monarchy should refuse to evolve. He remained irreplaceable because people are not offices. Titles can move forward, duties can be inherited. But personality, memory, and the shape one person leaves inside a family cannot simply be reassigned. Charles brought Anne and Edward together privately once the public debate had begun to settle. The king wanted the final meaning of the moment to belong to the family rather than to headlines. He also confirmed the institutional position clearly. Philip's personal legacy would continue to be commemorated as uniquely his, while Edward would develop the Duke of Edinburgh role in his own way. Institutional position simply means the official approach the royal household follows in presenting duties, titles, and legacy. This time, the distinction was deliberate. The man would not be confused with the office again. Anne looked at Edward and told him directly that she was proud he carried their father's title precisely because he had never tried to perform Philip's personality. Edward admitted that her original words had wounded him. For days, he had felt as though he were being measured against an impossible standard. But the painful argument had eventually relieved him of something he had quietly carried since receiving the dukedom, the fear that being different might look like failure. Anne placed the original Windsor speech on the table between them. Edward read the deleted passage one last time, the same blunt words that had triggered his sister's anger months earlier. Then he looked toward Charles and said the passage should be preserved exactly as written. No softening, no polishing. Their father, he argued, deserved to be remembered as he actually was. Charles accepted the criticism. He admitted that even he had sometimes allowed careful royal language to make Philip sound less complicated than life had made him. Complicated memories were harder to manage than ceremonial ones. But Anne understood what the king was finally saying. Love did not require simplification. Sophie joined Edward later and told him that the strongest thing he had done throughout the crisis was refuse to compete with a dead man for ownership of a living role. He understood exactly what she meant. Anne reached her own conclusion. Protecting Philip did not mean freezing the monarchy in his era. It meant allowing his contribution to remain unmistakably his, while others built something different after him. Philip's legacy was finally separated from imitation. Edward kept the title without carrying the impossible task of becoming his father. Anne kept the memory without demanding that change stop. Charles accepted that succession does not erase singular people. It proves their work survived long enough for others to carry it forward in their own way. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.